Let's continue with the tutorial on preparations to start a drawing. In this tutorial, you will learn concepts of limits, coordinate setup, and snap and grid modes. In this video, I deal with the limits command. But before exploring the concept of limits, I would like to give you an overview of the coordinate setup in AutoCAD. AutoCAD screen is assigned a Cartesian coordinate setup which you have learned in coordinate geometry. The UCS icon indicates the direction of X and Y axis. But there is also a Z axis which is pointed towards us. But if you want to see the direction of Z axis, you can hold down the shift key and press the scroll wheel of the mouse. You can tilt the coordinate setup and you can see the Z axis. I'll give undo to cancel this operation. There are grid lines in the screen running in the horizontal and vertical direction, just as you see in a graph paper. By default, the distance between each grid line is set at 10 units in both directions. If you want to change the grid spacing, just right click on the grid icon and go to grid settings, and you can change the spacing from 10 to any other value. And you can turn off the display of grids by clicking on the grid icon, and you can press once again to get the grids back. Using the F7 function key, you can toggle the display of grids. Similarly, there is a snap mode. When it is on, the cursor jumps from one grid point to another. For example, if I try to draw a line, the cursor jumps from one grid point to another, which will help me locate points precisely on the screen. Presently, snap and grid spacing are given the same value, but if you want, you can give a different value for the snap spacing. For that, you have to right click on the snap button at the status bar toggles and click on snap settings, and here you can give a different value. Snap mode can be enabled and disabled using the F9 function key. Now let's come back to the coordinate setup. Over here, you can see the first quadrant. Now I'm going to pan my screen. The origin got shifted and you can see the first quadrant here, second quadrant here, third quadrant, as well as the fourth quadrant. This is how you bring all the four quadrants within the screen. Now I'll right click and exit the pan mode. You know that AutoCAD screen is infinite in nature, like our universe, which goes from plus infinity to minus infinity in X and Y directions. But as a user, you don't need this entire screen to work, but you need only a rectangular area to create a drawing with a certain dimension. You have to set a limit to define this area. Setting limit is defined as the process of defining a rectangular area from an infinite screen to perform drafting or modeling. Conventionally, length and width are the minimum parameters required to define a rectangle. Or you can input 4 corner points to define a rectangle. But do you actually need these 4 corner points? No. In limits command, you actually define the lower left and the upper right corner. The coordinates of the upper left and the lower right can be calculated from the lower left and the upper right. The coordinate of the upper left can be obtained by extracting the x coordinate from the lower left and the y coordinate from the upper right. Since the lower left and the upper left are along the same vertical line, the x coordinate of these 2 points will be the same. Similarly, the coordinate of the lower right can be obtained by extracting the x coordinate from the upper right and y coordinate from the lower left. Hence, the coordinate of all the 4 corner points of the rectangle is obtained. When we set the limits, AutoCAD activates that area for the user so that we can perform 2D drafting or 3D modeling in it. After setting up the limits, you have to zoom that area so that it will fill up the entire screen. And this is a very important step to be followed. So I'll give zoom command, type Z for zoom, and click on all option. When you click on this option, the area which you have defined using the limits command will fill up the entire screen. From this illustration, it is clear that the limits which you have defined will be center justified with respect to the screen. You can draw outside the limits if required. If you do not give zoom all after setting up the limits, your limit may sometimes remain at a corner of the screen or it may lay outside the screen. But the moment you give zoom all, your limit will fill up the entire screen, center justified. Now I'll illustrate limits with some live examples so that you will get a better idea about this concept. Now let's set a proper limit to create this figure. When you go through the dimensions, you can see that there is no negative values here. So we can keep the lower left corner at the origin at 0, 0. And how will you define the upper right corner? For that, we have to find out the maximum dimension in this figure. Here the maximum dimension is 100 units. So you can set the upper right corner in such a way that its value is slightly more than the maximum value to be plotted. Since the maximum dimension is 100, we can give a value above 100, something like 125 or 150. I'll give limits. When I'm asked to define the lower left corner, I'll give 0, 0. When I'm asked to define the upper right corner, I'll give 125, 125. Now I'll give a zoom all. I'll give Z enter, A enter, or else you can click on the all option. Now this screen can accommodate that drawing. Next, let's consider this example. In this figure, there are 5 circles. Each circle at the corner has center point located at each quadrant. Center point of this circle is at 35, 35, which is in the first quadrant. This circle is in the second and this one in the third, and this circle is in the fourth quadrant. How will you set the coordinates for the lower limit in this example? This circle is at -35, -35. That means you have to give a value below -35 so that this circle will be well within the screen. So let's add the radius 17.5 along with 35, which is 52.5, and we should give a value below 52.5 so that this circle will be within the screen. So I'll give -60, -60 as the lower left. And the upper right is obviously 60, 60. Likewise, by setting lower left corner at -, and upper right at +, we could bring all the 4 quadrants within the screen. Now let's set the limits. I'll give limits command. I'll give -60, -60 for the lower left corner. I'll give 60, 60 for the upper right corner. Now I'll give zoom, enter, all to bring the limits within the screen. Now all the 4 quadrants are within the screen, but the icon which indicates the origin sits at the lower left corner. This icon can be taken to the exact origin location by giving the UCS icon command and click on the origin option. Now the icon is taken to the exact origin point. This is how you bring all 4 quadrants within the screen in AutoCAD. In this tutorial, we have learned the concepts of limits, coordinate setup, and snap and grid modes. In the next video, I'll teach you the various procedure to create lines,